Thales is considered the first Western philosopher, the father of philosophy. Now, this isn't exactly correct in that there were people prior to Thales who did these similar kind of investigations that he did. And, of course, there was philosophy in the eastern part of the world. So it wasn't just that Thales literally got the ball rolling. But nonetheless, his influence is immense in the Western world, as if he did get the ball rolling. He's kind of framed as the father of philosophy because he really begins this kind of inquiry into principles, into a rational account of the world that isn't just a kind of mythic tale. He lived around the 6th century BCE in Miletus, which was on the southwest part of what is now modern-day Turkey. Originally, they were an offshoot of the Greek mainland, and many Greeks settled in what is known as Ionia back then, in that part of Turkey. The kind of legend of Thales is immense, as I said, especially we have the quotes about water, which we'll get to a bit later. But I want to begin with this one quote that we find in Plato's Theaetetus. Now, it's unlikely this exactly happened as it's said in Theaetetus, but nonetheless, I think it captures the kind of account that people, non-philosophers, have of philosophers. So, in the Theaetetus, it said, "They say that once when Thales was gazing upwards while doing astronomy, he fell into a well, and that a witty and charming Thracian-serving girl made fun of him for being eager to know the things in the heavens, but failing to notice what was just behind him and right by his feet." There's this, transhistorical sense of philosophers captivated by the abstract, looking up, trying to, in the sense of perhaps Plato, looking at the forms, focusing on kind of the thing beyond appearances, beyond this world itself. Sometimes, perhaps naively so, right? Failing to, be useful for practical affairs, like not tripping and falling into a well, or, not even perhaps having common sense or thinking commonly in the way that other people do. Because philosophers are concerned with the true thing itself, something which can't be defined in relation to practical things. And that's where we see Thales begin, interested in the thing itself. What thing itself exactly? Historically, prior to the rise of philosophy in the West, there were accounts given of the world, certain stories that tried to make sense of the world, why there is existence at all, how the world works, how nature works. But it was always given in a kind of poetical myth-making, kind of stories, whether it be Homer or Hesiod, and so on, right? That are based in, rhyme and meter and verse and aren't exactly kind of giving rational arguments. But it's with Thales that we see this in the history of Western philosophy, this focus on causes and principles. Now, Thales wasn't just interested in kind of causes and principles. He did other practical things as well, as we'll see. But it's the fact that he tries to give a rational account of the transcendent universal principles that make possible existence that he is so influential. For Thales, that principle, the arche, the ultimate cause, is water. And it might sound weird. How could you say water, right? I don't think many, if not all of us, would think that water is the ultimate cause of existence. And yet, there's a kind of logic behind what Thales was arguing. Now, we don't have actual writings that survived from Thales, if he actually did write at all. So we have to look at kind of fragments taken from other people that lived mostly well after Thales was dead. Here in this case, we have a recount of Thales from Aristotle in the Metaphysics, where he says, "Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy that believes the only principles of all things are principles in the form of matter, stated it to be water. This is why he declared that the earth rests on water. He may have gotten this idea from seeing that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that even the hot itself comes to be from this and lives on this. The principle of all things is that from which they come to be. Getting this idea from this consideration, and also because the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is the principle of the nature of moist things. So there's a kind of reason when Thales looks at those which move in the world, those which have a kind of soul-like in the sense of a movement to them, right? And so we think of, plant life, animal life, and so on, right? What gives rise to that? What's its cause? And Thales says, well, we notice that it relies on water, right? That from water we get this kind of propulsion, this propensity to grow. Lack of water, things die. So the ultimate causes of the world is water. What Thales is giving here is the kind of earliest account in the West of cosmology, an account of the generation of the world, how the world comes into being. That's one of the two main branches of metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is known as the study of being, of essences, the study of natures. Another branch of metaphysics is ontology. So the study of essences, not necessarily how the world itself as a whole comes to be. And this is, again, what distinguishes Thales and kind of the birth of philosophy, in a sense, in the West, is this idea that we have to have a rational account of why things exist at all. That isn't just a kind of myth that's passed down through the generations that in colorful language, kind of persuades us why the world exists at all, right? No, it's a rational account that we can try to look at the world and apply to the world. It can be, in a sense, tested. Now, you might think, well, this sounds similar to maybe what the natural sciences are interested in. And yeah, but in the ancient Greek world, there wasn't this distinction between what now is called natural philosophy and science. Science was philosophy. In fact, the whole idea of natural science is distinct from philosophy is only a couple centuries old, that whole idea. But nonetheless, we get this idea of this search for an account, a rational account of the world from Thales. How do we actually make sense of this idea, though, that water is the ultimate cause or the ultimate principle of all things? Consider some quotes that we get from Aristotle in his text on the soul. Some say the soul is mixed in with the whole universe, and perhaps this is why Thales supposed that all things are full of gods. Or, from what is related about him, it seems that Thales too held that the soul is something productive of motion, if indeed he said that the lodestone has soul because it moves iron. So we have in this one sense this idea that all things are full of gods. And gods, if we think about in ancient Greek mythology, they're the kind of principle of excellence. Right? They have complete potential. All things are full of gods. And we think of kind of a god as that which enables movement, being. Well, Thales looks at magnets, and he sees that magnets, like a lodestone, has this ability to attract and repel forces. And so Thales says, well, it seems like the soul is something like a lodestone. It contains that kind of productive nature and able to bring things together, to repel them, to have movement. We find movement in water. It makes possible the growth of all things. The soul has to have that same principle. Now, it's important to note that this idea of the soul is not what we might think in like the Christian, Judeo, Islamic tradition of this idea that it's this transcendent, immaterial thing that's like who you really are, and it existed before you were born, and it's really contains like your personal identity and everything. That's not quite the same. The idea of the soul in the ancient Greek world is much more that it's a part of the world. It's this idea of movement, of growth, of life itself. There are many different accounts of what the soul is among ancient Greek philosophers. So it's, if we think about Aristotle's account of the soul, it's very different from, let's say, what we get with Thales or Heraclitus and so on. But nonetheless, it's important to not think of it in the way of the kind of Christian, Judeo, and Islamic account. How do we interpret this idea, though, about this propensity for movement, for generation that is water? What is Thales actually trying to say here? And there's two possible interpretations. Now, one is that the original state of things was water, and it continues now to be water. That everything literally is water. The other interpretation of what Thales is trying to say here is that water is a necessary condition for everything to be generated. So it's what allows things to come into being. But not everything then is literally water. It's just dependent on water. Now this is up to debate. Which account is correct? Which makes more sense? Maybe if we even take out this idea of water, what makes more sense talking about principles, the ultimate causes of all things? It would be like talking about existence. Is it the case that for things to exist, it has to be existence itself? Or is it the case that whatever being existence is makes possible things that come into being and that eventually degenerate and then go out of being and so on? This is a debate that's had well throughout the ancient Greek world, throughout the Middle Ages, and so on. Thales, just like all philosophers throughout history, was nonetheless criticized for being engaged in philosophy. What's the point of it? You're just talking about, what is the true nature of the world, and who cares what the true nature of the world is? It seems like a waste of time. How does it actually improve your life or change anything? Is philosophy useless? Now, Thales famously actually tried to prove, by using philosophy, I can do something useful. So, for example, he was an astronomer, studied the stars, and was able to predict a solar eclipse in 585 BCE. He also, through this studying of astronomy and the seasons, was able to predict when a good oil harvest would be. So how did he prove, though, that philosophy was practical? Well, what he did was he said, okay, if I know when this olive harvest is going to occur, I should buy up and all of the oil presses to make olive oil. That way, when there's this good olive harvest, people want to make olive oil, I have a monopoly on the oil presses. I can charge as much as I want for people to make olive oil, because they'll have a bunch of olives and they'll want olive oil. So that's exactly what he did. He created a monopoly on olive oil presses, showing, actually, look, I can make money. But his point was that we don't do philosophy. We don't study philosophy. We're not interested in truth just because of practical consequences. We're interested in truth for the sake of truth itself. That's still the idea behind philosophy. And it's still the very thing which philosophy has to defend itself against. This criticism that it's useless, or that philosophy is only good if it can give you practical consequences. Is Thales correct in his idea that, philosophy can be useful, but we don't study philosophy. We don't study truth because it's useful, but for the sake of truth itself?